Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
He's far from the only innocent person that was convicted.
He was shocked that Chris was still in prison.
I knew that I was innocent.
Do you still have that same set of clothes?
It's been updated and expanded. Still ready to go at a moment's notice.
I started having doubts.
Earlier this year, we introduced you to the case of Christopher Dunn. More than 30 years ago, evidence was brought against him in a 1990 murder trial. That trial, which involved the killing of a 15-year-old in a late-night shooting in St. Louis, put Dunn in prison to serve a life sentence. Chris Dunn was 19 at the time. He's 51 now. In those 3 decades, the evidence against him has dramatically weakened. The key witnesses, who were 12 and 14 in 1990, grew into adults. In 2018, they recanted their testimonies. Dunn was in the courtroom. He told us what that moment felt like.
To hear someone finally come forward and admit that they lied on me, how they lied, and how they influenced the other people to say that I was the perpetrator. To hear them say that, to vindicate me, it was a feeling like no other.
That was Chris Dunn, who spoke with us in January from the South Central Correctional Center in Licking, Missouri. Dunn remains in prison, his name still tied to a murder conviction. But a lot has changed about his case. In February, the exoneration and release of Lamar Johnson in St. Louis seemed to set an example of what could happen for him. And incredibly, it did. St. Louis's top prosecutor, Kim Gardner, filed a motion to vacate Dunn's conviction on May 12th. She said there was, quote, clear and convincing evidence, unquote, supporting his innocence. But things were not so clear. 4 days later, on May 16th, Gardner resigned as St. Louis Circuit Attorney, ending months of controversy over her management of the office. And after her resignation, St. Louis's new Circuit Attorney, Gabriel Gore, withdrew the motion, saying he had to review the case himself. Later this hour, we'll be joined live by Kira Dunn, Chris Dunn's wife, to talk about Gardner's support for Dunn's exoneration and where things stand now. But before that, we need to understand what happened in 1990 and the deadly shooting that led to Chris Dunn's life sentence. In January, I asked Dunn's then attorney, Kent Gibson, to describe the details of what happened on the night of May 19, 1990.
Well, the background of the case was these several young men, all of whom I think were still teenagers, were sitting on a porch late at night, and some shots rang out from an alley, and everybody scattered, but the one young man, Rico Rogers, was fatally shot. And then the police arrived, and 2 of the young guys on the porch subsequently said they could identify Chris Dunn as the shooter, and that was all they had. There was no physical evidence. And that was it. I think one of them was 14 at the time, or 15, and the other one was 12 or 13.
Yes.
So that's, in essence, what the evidence was.
So it was 2 young boys' identification of someone, and for something that occurred at nighttime, as you've noted. Now, we've also noted that the key evidence against Christopher Dunn has basically fallen apart in the past few years, and much of that has to do with those 2 witnesses at the trial in 91. And as you said, one was 12 years old and the other was 14. Both have recanted their testimonies. How did that affect this case?
Well, I mean, obviously when you have a case that's fairly tenuous to begin with, and the only evidence is discredited, you have a very strong case that you're innocent. So that's what we did. We initially filed it in the Circuit Court of Texas County, which is where the Licking prison is located. We were granted a hearing, presented the evidence, and the judge who heard the evidence found that in his view we met the test for showing that he was innocent, but he couldn't do anything about it because there was a decision in a case called Lincoln from the Court of Appeals in Kansas City that said you can only receive a new trial by showing you're innocent only if you're on death row. Since Chris didn't get the death penalty, he was out of luck.
Right. So then that 2020 ruling that was issued by Judge William Hickel did explain that he did not believe that any jury would now convict Dunn. And you've just talked about the death penalty, and this is in no way meant to make light of Christopher Dunn's situation. But given that context and the current challenges, I mean, might Christopher be better off had he been sentenced to death? Would that make his case somehow better or stronger?
It's a perverse thing, but he would have been executed probably before this evidence ever came to light.
Right. Now, while evidence for Dunn's freedom is new, the fight is not. And we're also joined today by Kira Dunn, the wife of Christopher Dunn, who has spent more than 2 decades advocating for her now husband's release. Kira, welcome to the show.
Hello, Elaine. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you first became interested in Christopher's case in 1999 while writing about it for a criminal justice reform website. Now, what was it that first drew you to this case?
Well, at the beginning, to be fair, I was assigned to the case. But what made it different than other cases I wrote about was how compelling the difference between the witnesses' police testimony versus what they said in court. The police interviews, of course, that were transcribed and did not align at all with what the witnesses said, but by the time they got to court, by then their stories miraculously matched. That was my first clue. And from there, I learned more about the case, spoke with Chris's prior attorneys, and I was convinced pretty early on that he was definitely innocent.
Was there anything else that contributed to your conviction that he had not done the crime he was convicted of?
Well, Chris is the person who will tell you the truth, good, bad, or ugly. And I saw that early on. I also saw that his case wasn't dissimilar to other cases I'd seen where there was sort of a rush to judgment when it came to getting a suspect and running them through the system. I mean, Chris was convicted in under 45 minutes of jury deliberation. Before he was taken before the jury, he was offered 10 years and then 20 years to plead out. And to my understanding, that's not something a prosecutor would do if they had a very strong case.
Can you tell us about the search for the witnesses whose 1991, that is, testimony led to your husband's conviction?
Yes, of course. So the first witness recanted via affidavit in 2005. That was something, he had come forward on his own. Chris was so surprised when he heard that this man wanted to recant. And once that affidavit was provided, our attorney at the time said, that's great, but we really need both to get anywhere. So we really started in earnest searching for the second one. He had a very common name, and it took us 10 years. I, being based in California at the time, had spoken with an ex-police officer I worked with about the case, and he went ahead and followed up on a lead that we'd gotten from our St. Louis investigator that there might be a match in California to some relatives of the second witness. Turned out the witness had a record out here, and that coworker of mine advised me to regularly check the jail logs because he might get, caught up again. And so I started to do so. And then one Sunday morning, I'm sitting at the table having coffee, and he popped up. Right birth date, right name. And I was, so excited, but I had to make sure it was the right person. So we sent our investigator down, and sure enough, it was. He said, "I remember it like it was yesterday," and told us what had happened. That nobody could have really seen who did the shooting because it was so dark, and the shots just came out. And as Kent said, they scattered, they ran.
Kara, was it difficult to convince the two witnesses to recant?
Oh, not at all. As for the first one, I wasn't involved. I found out not long after Chris found out that this man was doing this on his own. For the second one, from what our investigator told us, it was, as soon as he told our witness why he was there, he said, "Oh yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday." No, we couldn't see anything. We decided to say this, and he was shocked that Chris was still in prison for that. He had left the state not long after that and had no idea what had transpired in the years since.
We're going to go back to May 2018, which is when you sat in a Missouri court and watched the witnesses from Christopher's 1991 trial take the stand and recant their testimony. Also in the room was your husband himself, who described that moment of truth.
I knew that I was innocent, but to hear someone finally come forward and admit that they lied on me, how they lied, and how they influenced the other people to say that I was the perpetrator, to hear them say that, to vindicate me, it was a feeling like no other. I can't describe exactly the emotion that came over me. All I know is that I slumped down into the chair, bowed my head, and said to myself, "Thank you." And one by one, after each witness got up on the stand and started testifying, I sat there and I just knew eventually they was going to free me. I just knew I was going to walk out of jail that day. But when the judge had to give us a continuance and they didn't free me, I started having doubts. And I was going to be returned back to the Department of Correction. But in that moment, I felt like I finally did it. I finally cleared my name.
That was Christopher Dunn describing how he felt hearing witnesses recant in court their 1991 testimony that put him in prison to serve a life sentence for murder. Kyria, we just heard your husband describe the moment of that 2018 court hearing. What was it like to witness that moment, for the truth to finally come out?
Oh, yes. I mean, we were in tears. I was sitting with my in-laws, and especially when the first witness described why he'd lied and that he regretted doing so, and how he knew how it had impacted Chris's life. I mean, the judge wasn't tearful. He was angry. I remember his face reddening at the time, but we were in tears. We'd gone into that hearing very hopeful, but we really didn't know how it would all play out. And yeah, it was so compelling at the time that one court officer turned to the other and said audibly, should we call the institution to tell him to get his stuff ready to go?
Wow.
Yeah, and we really did think that he would walk out of there that day. We had long discussed the outfit he would wear. I had that ready. The family was there. We were so hopeful that day.
Even hearing you describe what it was like has me sort of holding my breath. Now, that dramatic 2018 hearing, unfortunately, did not lead to your husband's freedom. And 2 years later, in 2020, Judge Hickel wrote, quote, "This court does not believe that any jury would now convict Christopher Dunn under these facts," unquote. But under Missouri law, Hickel ruled that the 1991 conviction still stands. The decision was crushing, but today, Christopher says he still has hope.
Missouri has a way, sadly, in victimizing their citizens, even though the citizens themselves, like myself, is not guilty of a crime. But because they choose not to address the matter and want to sweep it up under the rug as if it never occurred. I could have lived with anger, bitterness, despair. I could live with frustration and hate. But it's not going to get me anywhere through life. I understand, sir, that people going to have doubt. That's human nature. But it's also in my nature to be free. If I was guilty of this crime, I would have said I was guilty when they offered me 10 years.
That was Christopher Dunn speaking this morning by phone from Missouri's South Central Correctional Center in Licking, Missouri. Kent, having both witnesses recant, it wasn't and isn't enough, and Christopher has now exhausted his legal appeal. What is the next step, and how might St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner and her office facilitate that?
Well, we've had an application pending in front of her office for quite some time under this law that was enacted in August of 2001 that gives a prosecutor the authority to file a motion in the trial court and give a defendant or a prisoner a hearing if they think either that he is actually innocent or his conviction was tainted by a constitutional violation. We've had a few conversations with various advocates and myself, but it's apparent, I think, that she is not going to file any such motion in any other case until the Lamar Johnson case is decided, which hopefully will happen soon.
Mm-hmm. And there are some striking similarities between Christopher's case and that of Lamar Johnson. Johnson's case was the subject of a 5-day court hearing in which prosecutors argued for his exoneration, which is something that that you just mentioned about what happened with Lamar Johnson. Kent, what are you watching for in that case, and could Christopher be next?
I'm hoping he is next in line. I guess how the prosecutor proceeds might depend on the outcome. If Lamar Johnson is exonerated, then I think it's hopefully that she'll do the same for other innocent prisoners, because we know from experience and just some of the problems with the criminal justice system in St. Louis that he's far from the only innocent person that was convicted in St. Louis City the last 30 years or so. Mm-hmm. And it's been a campaign promise both of her and Wesley Bell, who was elected in the county, to remedy miscarriages of justice, and thus far neither one of them have done so, or at least not utilize this new statute. There's a lot of guys waiting in the wings.
Kira, the Missouri justice system has, thus far, offered little in the way of recognizing your husband's wrongful conviction and sentencing based on the evidence that now exists. What is it that gives you hope that Christopher's case will indeed be heard and his innocence finally affirmed under law?
It does give me hope to see Circuit Attorney Gardner, being so strong in her support of Lamar Johnson. It also gives me hope that our legal team has a petition in front of the United States Supreme Court that we're hoping will be heard. The state of Missouri has been given until February 6th to respond, which I understand is a positive sign that it may be heard by the court, although we know our odds are slim. They hear maybe 1 or 2% of the cases that they're asked to hear. I'm also given hope by House Bill 360, which has been introduced into the Missouri legislature by Kimberly Ann Collins, a Missouri representative, and that would give judges the power that the 2021 law gave prosecutors to correct wrongful conviction that comes before them. If they see clear and convincing evidence, they would be able to vacate the conviction, order a new trial. It empowers the judges. And if that had been in place when Chris went before that judge in 2018, he would have walked out of that courtroom.
Is there something, Kira, that you and Christopher are doing to keep your spirits up?
Well, we try to turn our anxiety and the ups and downs that come with waiting into action. So we are reaching out on a daily basis to any people we think could help us spread the word and increase the chances that the nation becomes aware of the fact that in Missouri, and I think you asked Kent this, is Missouri the only state that has this type of law and precedent? Yes, it is. To our knowledge, it is. And innocence and guilt should matter in the United States.
That was Kira Dunn, along with attorney Kent Gibson, who spoke with us in January about Chris Dunn's case for innocence. When we come back, we'll talk live with Kira Dunn about the status of her husband's case for innocence and what it was like to be impacted by the controversial shakeup at the St. Louis Circuit Attorney's office. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. We're talking today about the case for the innocence of a man named Chris Dunn. He has spent more than 30 years in prison for murder, and in recent years, 2 key witnesses have recanted their previous testimony. In 2020, a Missouri judge wrote of his case, "This court does not believe that any jury would now convict Christopher Dunn under these facts." As we learned earlier this hour, Missouri law doesn't allow people like Dunn, who are sentenced to life in prison, to seek freedom, even if they prove they are innocent. Things changed in 2021 when a new Missouri law gave prosecutors the ability to file motions to vacate wrongful convictions. The process freed Lamar Johnson in St. Louis, and it seemed like Dunn was next, until he wasn't. To talk about what happened and the status of Chris Dunn's case for innocence, we have Kira Dunn with us. Kira, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Elaine. Thank you so much.
In the span of 4 days last month, Kira, from a Friday to a Tuesday, you got the news that Kim Gardner was seeking to free your husband and then learned that Gardner was resigning. What was it like to hear that?
Oh, it was amazing. After all the years that we've worked and the investigations and to see that Circuit Attorney Gardner was putting forth her support publicly for Chris was just astounding. I mean, we were overjoyed, over the moon.
And how did Chris take it?
Well, he was just in shock, really. We had certainly hoped for a long time, but to see have the actual news come out publicly was it was such great big news that we really didn't know how to react at first. As you know, we've had ups and downs over the years, and so we are always reluctant to get too excited or too hopeful about anything. But this was a big one. This felt momentous.
Yeah. So then learning that Gardner was resigning, did that put any sort of dent in the elation you were feeling at that point?
Well, it put an element of uncertainty in. We didn't know what would happen next if she would not be there to see the process through as she had for Lamar Johnson.
Now, on June 8th, Gabriel Gore, who was appointed by Missouri's Governor Mike Parson to take up that position of the top prosecutor, announced he was withdrawing the motion seeking a hearing on your husband's case. And he said, "We will conduct a full review of Mr. Dunn's case and proceed as the law and facts dictate." And then just last week, Gore spoke about Chris's case in an interview with the St. Louis American. And Gore didn't share much, but his wording stood out. He said, quote, It was procedurally necessary that I withdraw the motion, and I am now duty-bound to review it, make a conclusion, and determine whether refiling the motion is the proper thing to do. Now, his focus on withdrawal being part of procedure, part of his normal duty as a circuit attorney, does that give you hope, Kira, in a way that this could be restarted?
Well, Elaine, it was a huge blow for us, and we're still kind of recovering from that. Mm-hmm. But we do have hope. Mr. Gore is an outstanding attorney in his own right, and we're confident that when he does look into the facts of the case, he will reach the same conclusion as Judge Hickel did in 2020 when he wrote that Chris had met the standard for innocence, and what Ms. Gardner saw prior to filing that motion, that Chris has proven his innocence, and in fact, in any other state in the United States. Mm-hmm. That would have been enough to bring Chris home. It's only in Missouri that it's not enough.
Now, we mentioned that Gardner filed this motion seeking a hearing for your husband's innocence, and that would have been the first step in determining at a special kind of trial whether Chris had been wrongfully convicted. And this was the same sort of hearing that freed Lamar Johnson back in February. What did you take away from Lamar Johnson's getting his freedom that you carry with you now, especially, in this, you've talked about being in times of uncertainty for a long period. Is there anything now that you kind of look to about Lamar Johnson and his being freed?
Well, it was a great inspiration. It was a wonderful inspiration to see the teams come together and support Lamar. We're fortunate enough to have the support of, the amazing Midwest Innocence Project now, and to see the work that they put in, despite the opposition they received, that was ultimately successful in bringing Lamar home. Yes, I mean, we hold on to that. I hold on to that vision of, the broadcast of him walking out with people there supporting him. I guess, Elaine, if I could say, we do look to that and hope that Chris is next. And, the evidence we know has not changed.
Sure.
And we believe that Mr. Gore will see the truth as well when he looks into it.
Mm-hmm. And is there something in particular about the Midwest Innocence Project that has you feeling optimistic?
Well, certainly, they're an outstanding group. They're passionate about what they do. They're effective in what they do. And their success with Lamar only increased our confidence that they can do the same when working with our case for Chris.
And Chris's case and the work that you all have done, I can imagine that it has inspired other people. Have you encountered folks who are looking at what you've been doing around Chris's case who have been inspired to pursue their own struggles for justice?
I think that the other cases I know of have been ongoing. There are certainly other people with innocence cases, so I don't know. I think that what happened with Lamar Johnson was inspiring to many, but at the same time, it's a very involved, exclusive process. So it's not something that is easy to come about, and that's why we were so elated and so hopeful when we did receive that support from Ms. Gardner.
Well, and the last question here, when we spoke some months ago, you talked about the set of clothing that you had ready for Chris to don when he gets his freedom. Do you still have that same set of clothes? Have they been updated for this weather?
It's been updated and expanded to account for what we were hoping would be a days-long hearing. So yes, it's all still ready to go at a moment's notice. So yes, On our end, we are ready. We're just hoping for good word soon.
Kira Dunn is the wife of Chris Dunn, a Missouri man who spent more than 30 years in prison for a crime witnesses now say that he did not commit. Kira, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today, and best of luck to you.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for having us on and featuring Chris's case. Thank you.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski,
with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.